So we are back from the break for the panel discussion. We prepared two topics to discuss, but we want to involve the audience as much as possible with this discussion and maybe have it all together. As we mentioned before, this is our first event, so we don't have experience in how it goes, frankly, and we'll see how it goes. So
Great seeing
all
all
the
these
speakers,
faces.
yes, popping up on the screen. Okay, so we've also noticed that during the break there's been discussion on YouTube, and I see that Anders has been an active participant there. Do you maybe want to update us on what's been going on?
Well, there was this interesting question about does autism have a place in transhumanism? And besides, of course, the generally inclusive nature, I think, of a movement, there is something very important about having cognitive diversity. We need emotional, embodied, and cognitive diversity because we need different ways of thinking about things and solving problems. And then somebody brought up another important thing. Yeah, but sometimes maybe you can get bad, weird ideas. And I think the really interesting thing is, historically so far, the really atrociously bad ideas humanity has got are usually amplified, fairly standard human ideas. They're not the unthinkably weird ideas, but rather the all too human ideas. But there is a real challenge in a world where we can manipulate each other using digital information or optogenetics or normal genetics or any other means. How do we maintain integrity? That might be a design thing we might want to work rather hard on. And it's both kind of a hardware technical problem. It might be the social software technical problem we need to pursue.
I think this debate about integrity is something that Kevin Esvelt is also focusing a lot on, if I understand correctly. So I'm curious to what your view on that is.
So I think overall, this is one where I agree with Anders. I think we differ most on our optimism pessimism, because I happen to be in what is probably the most offense dominant field of destructive technology, and so I'm probably a little more pessimistic than is warranted for technology as a whole. But in terms of the potential bright future, I generally agree that there is a lot that we can and should explore that is profoundly good. Mm-hmm. And the way that we get there is being respectful of how little we actually know. I mean, the human moral space is probably so impoverished compared to all the possible moral systems one could imagine. Why on earth would you assume that anyone has got it right? I mean, after all, we generally condemn most past generations for getting one or another thing horrifically wrong. Do you suddenly think that we've all figured it all out? Like, that's pretty profoundly arrogant. So I prefer to acknowledge that, I mean, look, even in mathematics, you can't have consistency and completeness at the same time in the same formal system. What makes you think morality is any different? So I would advocate, let's be a little bit less arrogant about this. Let's be humble enough to say we don't actually know what is right. So some people have called for a long reflection, that we need to first sort out how to not blow ourselves up or otherwise have problems like that. And then just sit around and think and let people explore different ways of being and decide what we should do. What are our responsibilities to one another, to the many other living things that we share this world with, to our ideas morally relevant, like they're replicating informational patterns just like sequences of DNA. What is relevant about us? Are we our biology, or are we our ideas? How we need to figure all of this out before we make rash decisions. But at the same time, it's plausible that we might actually want to not put all our eggs in one basket. Yeah. So there's a tension between these ideas, but I am very much in favor of exploring more modes of thought than we have currently dared to dream of, because as we know, there's always more of which to dream.
Yeah, of course.
I will probably never stop dreaming either.
Yeah, and about dreaming, there is an interesting question in the chat. So what if superhumans get more intelligent than its creators? Would they take over and create superhumans? And where would it stop? Peter, what do you think about it?
Well, this is, of course, part of a discussion we have in AI safety. The traditional worry was, well, if you get a sufficiently smart machine that can do things that humans can do, one of the things humans have been able to do is making smarter machines, so it might make smarter and smarter machines, and then it takes off arbitrarily far. And I think to some extent, this is, of course, what has already happened. Those monkeys I was joking about in my talk, they in some sense created super monkeys. And we, the super monkeys, are making ourselves super monkeys. And it's moving on much faster than evolution would normally do.
Yeah.
Now, the real question is, where does it stop? There's both a rate limit. You can only modify genes so much, even though iterated embryo selection takes that up to 11. But having ideas spread around is also super powerful. That also accelerates things. And it might very well be that when we add a bit of artificial intelligence and other things, that speeds things up more. I think there are physical limits. In some sense, there are very boring limits on how fast quantum states can flip and how much mass and energy you can use to do computation. But that doesn't actually tell us anything meaningful about where it stops. I don't think we have a good idea where it stops.
And now I see that Ed Boyden is back. So welcome. We will just
Hello,
started.
everybody. Good to see you all.
Good to see you too. So there is an interesting point from Gennady Stolerov in the chats, Victor.
Yeah, the problem with a long reflection, as was mentioned before, is that we would age and die while engaging in it. And we need to radically push forward to reverse senescence now, so we have all the time in the world to reflect later. Yeah, I guess this perfectly describes the opposing point of view. I'm wondering, actually, maybe from the point of view of Peter Joost, what do you think about these two contrasting views?
Yeah, an interesting point, also a political one. If I recall, if I have the name correct of the commenter. So and that's also what makes me think, because I think the general consensus among the speakers is about the reflection time. But yeah, you can also indeed argue that there are some issues we have to deal with as human species right now. Think of, for one, the climate crisis, but also the growing inequality. That there are indeed also, yeah, you can also make the argument that we need action on that now. And I'm not sure if it has to do with transhumanism, because I think in a sense the word transhumanism is a little bit misleading, because transhumanism is always something that seems to be in the future, while for people in the 1950s, when they are time traveling till our current day and age, they think they are envisioning a transhumanist world, maybe. So maybe also the goalpost is moving ahead. So yeah, I'm also curious about, for example, Yoeri's take, because you also mentioned the multidisciplinary action. Yeah, what do you think of that question?
So, if I correctly understand it, it's about whether transhumanism is something that we want to envision or go into now and make ourselves better, or whether we really want to reflect a little bit first before doing that. Well, I guess it depends on the situation, and I also have the feeling this was a similar debate when AI was actually getting more and more important. So you have these AI networks that can very easily find cancer on photos of MRI scans or CT scans, and at that point it's really helpful for a lot of people. But then if you use those similar networks to actually make a decision whether a gun is autonomously shooting humans, then it's the other. So I think while you're doing it, you have to have these discussions like we're doing now, actually, and to have philosophers and people thinking about the implications, and even maybe put some people that have some power to actually decide whether things can go through or not. But I think it's not a. I'm not an expert on these things, but I think it's better to try things for the greater good than just to wait and see whether it's actually worth it in the end.
It's interesting you mention people who have power. But who should be those people who have power to decide such important things? Should it be scientists who understand the technology, or some government people? Who should
Yeah, I
it
don't
be?
know. Ideally, it would be a government advised by people in the fields, I guess. So we scientists, we don't like to have power usually. So
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
what I if I can intervene, what I really liked was to make a little bit of marketing for a series on Netflix in which also Kevin Esvelt was featured, Unnatural Selection. And one of the episodes, what I really liked is where you were visiting a city council, if I remember, on an island to talk about gene drive of rats or mice. I don't remember, but that really made me think about the question Mariia just asked, like who should be decide about it? Should we leave all the voting powers to Anders and his fellow philosophers, or
Oh no! Oh no!
or should it be general public? But yeah, I'm just curious also on the opinion of other speakers, because as a base point, I would say it should be a democratic initiative where everybody should be involved, and not only the current politicians, at least in the Netherlands and the EU. They're also they are focused on the 4-year term to be re-elected. It's really difficult to get the dilemmas of, as you also can see with the pandemic, but especially also biotechnology, germline modification, to have a debate about it among policymakers. So I'm curious, what would be the governing ethical decision board or debate on this issue?
So it's quite easy to think that it's the government's job to do it all, but a lot of the ways we're interacting and deciding what we can and cannot do is set by other factors too. After all, the big internet platforms to some extent limit on what you can say and do online. Politeness and what your friends and family will say also control a fair bit of what we do. We have various forms of control, and similarly, we exert various forms of power. So quite often we say it should be a democratically decided decision, but usually that doesn't mean that we have everybody vote for something, because quite often that produces very stupid results. Ideally, you want to have a bunch of representatives we mostly agree represent our views and are mostly sane, and they can hash it out because we have better things to do in our lives than deciding tax rates. So there are various tools and mechanisms. And I think it's worth recognizing that this is also a form of technology. About 300 years ago, the printing press started to increase the ability to process and move information around in society. And people started innovating various pieces of the governance technologies. Over in Venice, for example, they had these very complicated systems of elections and selection for committees that would be very hard to game. Now, others invented various forms of parliaments and ways of running political parties. And gradually, we have taken the best of these systems and patched them together into governance systems. It's just that recently we had another printing press. We got so much more powerful tools, and we still haven't figured out much of the technology in this bigger governance space. So this is, again, something where I think people interested in the social and political side of transhumanism have a lot of important work to do. We need to kind of aggregate preferences and come up with compromises that allow us to make sometimes very, very important or even harsh decisions in a way that most people say, yeah, that's legitimate. I hate it, but I have to live with it.
I think that's a very fun point, because in making those types of decisions, like obviously we as humans like to be as rational as possible, or at least think we are, but often there's also an emotional component in there.
course.
And there's a very interesting question about that in the chat from Adrian. Could you pull it up?
Yeah.
Thank you. Which is a question for Ed Boyden. Let's say we look at this emotional aspect. Could we actually simulate emotions within the brain, maybe, and how useful would that be? And isn't there a second part to that equation besides the brain, which is the different level of hormones within the body?
I guess it depends on what the definition of the word useful is for the first part. And I think there's at least two kinds of use. One is to understand what an emotion is. And the other, of course, is that many disabilities like untreatable depression or anxiety disorders and so forth cause a lot of suffering. In my hope is that the simulation could be quite useful for both. If we can see what the nuances of how a neural circuit implements an emotion occurs, maybe it would help with both understanding and with repair. Regarding the second part of the equation, absolutely, hormones, excuse me, but also going beyond hormones, the microbiome in the gut, influences of all sorts of things, the immune system, everything interfaces to each other. So when we talk about the brain, I think that's shorthand for the brain and everything that connects to it, right? Because you can't just treat a system in isolation without considering all of its influences. And so one of the key things I think that is going to emerge is the need to be able to map across not just the brain, but the body. And a lot of exciting neurotechnology that's occurring right now from groups like Polina Anakeva's group at MIT, for example, and others, is to look at the distribution of neural signals throughout the body and how they can influence the brain. And there are so many remaining to be discovered.
Yeah, and maybe those types of interfaces with the body to check these types of things, is that also something that Yoeri could focus on in the future?
Certainly, this is definitely something that we're very interested in. So I always like to imagine a prosthetic arm, as I said, that depends on the certain neurotransmitter that is emitted. So if you have adrenaline, then it actually should move faster than, for instance, if you have a lot of dopamine, you're more happy, then you want to be a little bit slower, for instance. So using those signals directly for enhancing prosthetics for people without arms, or even, we're in a transhumanist panel, so even people who want to have just better arms, I guess that's why not? That's a nice idea, yeah.
Yeah, nice. There is also an interesting question in the chat close to the topic from Cameron. How do the panelists, so all of you, conceptualize the implications of altered states of consciousness on the transhuman race? If we cannot simulate these experiences through technology, can we create consciousness at all?
Well, there is, of course, that classical philosophical question. Well, would a software replica of my mind have my experiences? And there is one gang of philosophers who happily say, oh, yes, it's performing the same function. That's going to be having your consciousness. And then you get another gang saying, no, no way, no way. And then, of course, you get a whole group set of other philosophers having more complicated views. We don't know. I think the best approach would be to take kind of Searle, leader of one of the gangs, saying that computers can't be conscious. And if we make a software Searle, and software Searle says, darn, I was wrong, I need to write a paper, then we have learned something. But that might be rather far away. In general, of course, what consciousness is a darn hard problem, not just for philosophers, but also for neuroscientists and psychologists. And we certainly have tools that affect consciousness in the form of drugs, or for that matter, various forms of stimulation of the brain. I think if brains become more accessible, I think we're going to learn a lot more about consciousness. But it's tricky because you need to have a functioning brain that can report back. And it's so much easier to work on fixated brains in a block of plastic.
Hmm. This sounds like something Ed Boyden would also have an opinion about. So I'm actually very curious on that.
Well, we don't yet have a consciousness meter, right? You can't plug something into your laptop and point it at somebody and say, you're conscious. In fact, you don't know for sure if I'm conscious, right? Maybe I'm just a very accurate robot, and the real Ed Boyden is off on a beach somewhere enjoying a lovely day, sipping a daiquiri and enjoying the waves. And so that's kind of one of the biggest problems as a scientist that I think we do face in neuroscience. And consciousness is an internal state, and it's subjective, and there's not an obvious way to measure it currently. And that's something that I think we have to invent a new strategy for. But of course, it's very difficult to see that path with existing science. And that's one reason why I hope the tools that we build can pave the way to thinking more about it.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
To a little bit change the topic, there is a question to us actually in the chat. It asks, why is there no transhumanist group organization in the Netherlands? Well, we are a transhumanist group in the Netherlands. we are HEART, which stands for Human Augmentation Research and Technologies. Yes, we develop the technologies, but one of our main pillars is raising awareness about human augmentation and doing these kinds of
Yeah, I think
events.
basically our team started with this general question: why doesn't something like this exist? So yeah, get in contact with us on this. We are of course looking to expand there.
So may I interject here that there was at least a Dutch transhumanist group, Transedo. So this was back in the Stone Age, back in the 90s, long before there wasn't blogs. We were communicating by something called mailing lists, done probably by banging stones together. But back in 1998, they actually organized the first World Transhumanist Association meeting, Transvision, in Weesp outside
Yeah,
Amsterdam. So that it existed. So you're kind of inheriting the mantle now.
That would be great.
yeah.
So I've noticed there's been a lot of talk about aging and people pushing back on the long reflection based on we shouldn't let people age and die. I totally agree. The long reflection only happens once we're safe from existential risk and suffering and death. The challenge is going to come, what about when we look really hard at, say, children suffering? And then we're going to have fierce arguments between folks who say this is unacceptable. We are allowing innocence to suffer. We must rewrite the nature of humanity to prevent innocence from suffering, versus those who say, whoa, 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 we're in a long reflection here. And so saying, where do you draw the line? But I think we can all agree that we need to solve existential risk and senescence and death. Now, the challenge, I think, there's a lot of promising senolytics research and so forth. But from a biological perspective, probably the most reliable way forwards for restoring youth and health is really only suitable for cartoonish villains, even if it's ethically okay. And that is something along the lines of take some of your cells, reprogram them to make induced pluripotent stem cells, then basically do the beginnings of cloning yourself. But first, edit your cells so that you can't actually develop much of a prefrontal cortex that would be functional. And Ed would know much more about exactly which genes would do this for which disorders. But so you just couldn't become a person at all in the resulting being. Then actually do the IPS transformation and implant into an artificial womb. So you got to develop those too. And then grow up this baby, which would, there wouldn't be anybody home. And then grow it up until it's, 12 or so, and then do a head transplant.
Yeah.
So ethically, there's not a person there. There's not even as much as a mouse. Like a mouse would have more personhood. You could argue, probably maybe not a worm, but a fly certainly would have more personhood than this being. It would be your body with no brain, basically, or as close to it as you can get. So from most ethical perspectives, and I would defer to Anders here, of course, this looks plausibly okay, but the optics are about as bad as you can imagine. Like, talk about cartoonish supervillain way to path to immortality, grow up your own, cripple the brain development of your own clone and then lop off their head and stitch yours on in its place. That's pretty awful. But right now, it's probably looking like the most plausible. So if anyone in the audience wants to go for that and figure out how to do the much harsher problem of rehabilitating the image, by all means.
So I think the interesting thing is this shows that there might be some pathways to certain ends that we might say, yeah, it could work, but no, it's too yucky. And in some cases, it might be that, yeah, ethically, we're not allowed to do it. But it might also be that, yeah, some methods are actually just too plain disgusting. There are actually a lot of cultural choices in what technologies we get. So when you think about life extension, I think most of us would prefer it to be a little pill. Maybe injections of stem cell. If we had to do parabiosis, exchange blood with younger organisms, that's already in cartoon villain territory, even if we did this in a relatively ethical way. And this, of course, goes for quite a lot of other technologies too. It's not just that we select what works most efficiently. Even in areas like big business or the military, quite a lot of technologies have not been chosen because they're the most effective. But do they fit with our cultural values? And being clear about these values, I think, is super useful. So the long reflection, I think one can always start a bit early with that, just thinking about how do we think about our place in nature and the universe? Because that's quite often the source of a lot of arguments about transhumanism. A lot of critics have a particular view of what's natural and how we're supposed to fit into that natural order. And then others show up and they don't share that view and just say, we could do this and this, and this would be great. But it's against their unstated assumption about what the natural order is. But of course, since we rarely bring up what we think the natural order is, because that sounds a bit silly, people instead bring up, well, what about safety? What about inequality? What about life extension making dictators live forever? And even when you knock over the arguments, for example, the dictator argument is very fun. I've been doing the statistics on that, and it only gives 4 more years. They, of course, the critic will immediately bring up another one, because the real thing is, yeah, it doesn't fit with the natural order they envision. And I think we should be more open discussing what kinds of natural or unnatural orders we accept and find reasonable. That's both good for openness and also for getting really interesting conversations late in the evening over a glass of wine. But I think it also actually helps dealing with a lot of the critics.
But do you also think, because that's something that comes up with me while I'm listening to the discussion, like if we have more healthy years, then we have more time for reflection and think about the natural order. But would at the same time, the majority, like 90% of society, will spend the more time they have on Instagram and Netflix?
Yeah, but if they get happy from that, and hopefully we can find something that makes people fulfilled and happy, and not just is like chewing gum for the soul, then that's fine. After all, very few people have ever wanted to actually be philosophers or scientists or engineers. It takes a particularly kind of weird mind to think that that's a good thing to do. Most people are fairly happy to be couch potatoes, and we might want to help them to be the best couch potatoes they could ever be in, because and if they want after a while to actually, it seems like the scientists are having all the fun, we should help them become the scientists.
I like actually, Peter, how you say that at some point 90% of people will have extended lives, because that's topic I find really interesting, and I think somebody already mentioned it in his talk at some point. All these technologies, right? If you want to grow a fully new body up until it's 12 years old without being conscious, I imagine they will be crazy expensive. So only available to a very small part of the population, especially in the beginning stages. And this could lead to a traumatic, changes in access or differences in access to these technologies. Is there any way that we could prevent that at all? Or is that just an inevitable thing of this development? I'm curious as to what your opinion is on this.
I think just like in the line of arguments that Anders just shared, is that indeed one of the one that is mentioned the most. I think also in your polling you did in the second break that the societal impact concerns people the most, also with ethical, which are of course closely related. So I'm not sure, because on the one hand, there are people, advocates that say, take for example CRISPR, it's way more, it's way cheaper than previous similar technologies. But on the other hand, I cannot afford with the lab equipment and also the specialized knowledge to do the supervillain experiment by Kevin Esvelt on myself. So just to take that as a running gag, I hope you don't mind. So I'm, and I think that would also be like more a political choice, and also be like for whom is this technology available. Maybe we get into like not only a base income in the future, but also like a sort of welfare state in which we in Europe can envision even more because of our current situation compared to the US, where you maybe instead of only being helped with certain diseases, you can also get access to certain upgrades in the future just to get a level playing field. But these are all like system change, and also maybe change our idea of what is our current human nature. So I think there's also in that domain there's a lot of work ahead.
There is also an aspect of what kind of technology it is. So this is actually something Rames Nan, another fellow transhumanist and science fiction writer, mentioned to me offhandedly many years ago at a break and a conference. It stayed with me for a long time. And that is gadgets like smartphones and pills. They come down in price exponentially, especially once the patents run out, because you can mass produce them and they just become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Services, on the other hand, tend to stay pretty expensive because you need to pay the nurses and doctors maintaining your evil genius lair. Those minions, they want a salary. And that means, of course, that any enhancements that you can package as a pill or as a gadget can relatively quickly become everybody's. Anything that has to be a service will tend to be expensive. Sometimes we decide, okay, this is expensive, but it's so good we need to give it to everybody, like healthcare, like education. We might even make some enhancements mandatory, like education. So the choice we have here as researchers and technologists and visionaries is to try to figure out ways of packaging things so at least the more safer ones can become these exponentially cheaper ones. This is incidentally why I'm kind of admiring the tool makers among you. I mean, Ed, Kevin, and Yoeri, you have made tools that enable us to do the first steps in making the things that can then come down exponentially. I think the sad thing in science is that we typically tend to award somebody who figured something out, but usually didn't make anything useful. But if you invent a tool, that's usually how you create entire burst of science, which we're kind of seeing right now with the brain, with the neural implants, with gene drives. So first you need to get that burst, then package it into the gadget. And then I think inequality is going to become a relatively small problem.
Hmm.
Well, I'd just like to note that the consequence of that is vast cities full of factories with spare bodies slowly being grown in pods, because you ship everyone their little kit in the mail and they swipe their cheek and then they put it back in and then they send it back to the factory, which automated does all the cellular reprogramming and begins growing it and has the tanks of artificial wombs and all the maintenance for the bodies and so forth. And sure, that doesn't require any doctors or nurses or service. You can give the evil overlord plan for immortality to everyone. But it would be much better if we could just print those bodies using a 3D printer to begin with. And I think everyone would be much happier with that.
Yeah.
Even if on a molecular scale, the results are identical. You have to think about whether people are interested. Because look, if you invent an immortality serum and people aren't willing to take it, on some level, you are morally responsible for failing to save all those people from death.
And of course, even if you could 3D print a new, better body for people, there are always going to be some saying, I want a free-range organic body.
Yes, but you have to take that into account, right? Yeah. People can believe what they want to believe, and you have to do the best you possibly can for them regardless. Yeah. So this is why our mantra is always, when going to communities for eco-technologies, it's different. Medicine, your doctor recommends that you can say no. But you're proposing to change the environment, that's going to affect everybody. Even if they vote on it, they get outvoted, it's getting jammed down their throats. They're going to be affected no matter what. So the key is not so much governance. Do you want to use it or not? It's giving people a voice in the early stages of technology development, because that's what will determine the eventual scope of the application, the flavor of the application, as well as the risk-benefit profile in terms of tuning it within the parameters of what is technically possible. If you just invent it all on your own based on what you think people want, then you're very probably going to be wrong. They're less likely to accept it, and then you'll have wasted all of your time. Whereas instead, our rule is, it's your environment, it's your call.
Yeah, I think that it's also a big theme in at least what we experience as a student on TUE, that this is involving end users in the beginning stages, thinking about who's actually going to use this technology. It is very much incorporated in education. So I'm actually curious to Yoeri, if that's also a focus point in the research that you are doing yourself.
Yoeri?
Yes, yeah, sorry, I was muted still. Yes, certainly. So we always go from two sides. One is the fundamental, the interesting part of the materials, how to modify them, how to optimize them. But we always have an end goal in mind. So it can be a smart biosensor that we can retrain with these materials. It can be brain implants that we're currently thinking about connecting with these types of cells. So it's always about some kind of nice application that you can envision in the future. But I agree with the other speakers that it's not something that, I mean, it's very difficult to predict the future. So what would actually be useful, that's not up to us, of course. So for me, it's more interesting to work fundamentally on providing tools and providing new systems that people can actually, sometimes people come to me, oh, can we use your materials also for this type of device or application? And this is actually what you want, of course. So to open up a new types of application field using your technology, your materials, instead of you dictating the public that they have to use this smart biosensor that we are developing. So I think it comes from both ways, yeah.
Of course, yeah. I'm also actually happen to know that Boyden has his own company that is focused on treating Alzheimer's, and I suppose it's in more of early stages. But I'm curious how you view the accessibility of technology. Do you take this into account?
The accessibility of the technology, yeah. Well, that's one reason why in my little mini lecture I tried to point out that there's this old way of thinking about biomedical research, right? There's basic science, often driven by curiosity and serendipity, and then translational work, where the goal is to help a specific patient population. I think technology adds a third leg to the tripod. It doesn't have to be a dichotomy between these two choices. What if the technology can accelerate the basic science so we know what the heck we're doing and reduces the risk of translation? Because currently, of course, for the brain, just as an example, the clinical failure rate is nearly 100% for most therapies, right? I switched from engineering into neuroscience 23 years ago, and during that time, we've had barely any new treatments, much less cures for any brain condition. So the pathway goes from invention to discovery to design, as I summarized earlier. In the case of the Alzheimer's therapy, Li Wei's group used optogenetics to make the initial discovery that brainwaves could clean up lots of interesting and important amyloid, tau, cognitive, and other features. So that's the discovery. But then when it came to the design phase, and this is where another MIT professor, Emery Brown, made great contributions as well, the teams working together under Li Wei's leadership showed that you could induce the same brainwaves with a movie, right? And so imagine an era where, a flickering light on a display, some kind of auditory device, that's pretty cheap nowadays, right? I mean, there are literally billions of such devices that are routinely discarded as a new, slightly faster, slightly spiffier phone or other device comes online. Accessibility, I think, can emerge from this philosophy. And a similar philosophy applied to the expansion method, right? So, nanoimaging is a very important area, right? Electron microscopy, super resolution microscopy, multiple Nobel Prizes have been given for those technologies. But then our group decided, let's figure out a way to do that so that you wouldn't require any new equipment. Just take a brain and make it 1,000 times bigger with a really dirt cheap set of chemicals. So anyway, take a step back. I think there's both a strategy for developing technologies, and I like this invent, discover, design way of thinking. But secondly, if deployability is part of your goal from the beginning, then it can be part of every step. You can make your inventions usable by thousands of researchers. You can make the discoveries powerful. You can make the designs accessible.
That is a lot of food for thought. Maybe actually we are nearing the end in the schedule. I'm actually curious if maybe one of the speakers would like to have a closing comment on if the audience would have to take away at least one thing from tonight. What do you think the most important thing would be?
I would actually be interested to hear answer to this question from every one of you.
So let's start with Anders in that case. Go on order as we see him on the screen.
So I think my big message is the future is radically open. it's kind of getting defined by our ideas that are fundamentally unpredictable. And if we can just keep the future open, I think we have an opportunity to make it truly grand. So I think that's kind of guiding principle one should be trying to apply.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm the next in line. Well, I was thinking I want to just give kudos to the organization and also mainly to the fellow speakers, because I think one of the most important things is that we have these technologies, this scientific progress, and at the same time that such remarkable scientists are also willing to share their time and energy to also enlighten us as myself as just a layperson on their discoveries. I made a lot of notes, so I think science communication is a big part of our transhuman future. So I think you all done a great job.
Yeah, thank you. Yoeri, it's your turn.
Yeah, so also I fully agree with Peter. Very nice that you organized this. I think this is also one of the take-home messages I guess I have, that there's a lot of things people can do by themselves, but if we really want to go forward, I think it's important to have these types of forums and to talk with each other, being from widely different fields and research fields. I talked about multidisciplinarity being important. You can never be an expert on everything, and if we have these discussions, but also on ethics and the implications on the future and the technology in the future, I think that's very important, and together we can move forward. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Kevin.
Yeah, similarly, this has been beautifully run. So thank you for the opportunity in putting this together. And I suppose my parting thoughts would focus pretty heavily on this question of thinking as far ahead as we can, because it's all too easy to be shaped by the day-to-day or even just year-to-year incentives. I mean, for those of us in labs, what can we publish? Okay, what promising things do we need to write in order to get the grant money, in order to pay the salaries, so that when we can do some work, and then we have to report on it, so that then we can get more money. And that doesn't necessarily lead you to think about your longer term direction. What are we working towards? How are what we are doing going to help as many people as possible? And how are we even certain what help means? So advancing technology needs to somehow be coupled to cultivating wisdom and inviting others with very different perspectives, very different ways of thinking about the world, ways of perceiving the world, with extraordinarily different value systems. I think some of the most profound things I've learned in the last few years were speaking with the Maori of Aotearoa, because they have a profoundly different worldview and just sense of how things are connected than most folk in Massachusetts, especially those around MIT. So exposure to different modes of thought, I think, can help us better understand where we might go. And so for those of us who hope for a flourishing future of expansion in our ways of mind, as well as the length of our lives, I think there is no better way than to combine our thoughts in fora such as this one. So thank you.
To summarize, as far as I understand, I can make a reference back to Anders' thought during his presentation. So you should think about the seat belt before you develop in the car, kind of, right? But yeah, okay, thank you. And then finally, Ed, what would you say to the take-home message?
Well, I think there's a great desire to improve things, but we need to have understanding so that we can achieve what we want. I think that sort of resonates with the themes that many people have mentioned, whether it's thinking about the future or. But I do sense where there's a tension between understanding and getting stuff done. An analogy that I often make is, suppose it's the year 1600 and you want to land on the moon. All the money on Earth won't get you anywhere near the moon because we don't understand gravity, we don't understand calculus. And so suppose you were in charge of funding science in the year 1600, would you have funded Newton to study F equals ma and gravity, or Leibniz to study calculus, or Newton and Leibniz, depending on which camp you're in? Anyway, math joke. But the point I'm trying to make is, if you really wanted to land on the moon in the year 1600, you would have wanted to go after a lot of deep understandings that would have maybe been counterintuitive. And if you didn't go down that path, all the money on Earth would have resulted in people tying kites to chairs, and they would have all died. So I do think that there's this, need to understand, and we want to translate, and maybe the way to reconcile them is by building tools to accelerate our understanding so that we can translate.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all your wisdom tonight. I think that goes for us, but also for all the attendees. Normally we would hear a large applause, but we can do this one.
Our whole team applause here. Thank you.